I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a lecture about statutory interpretation and regulation, administrative agencies. And we're really talking here about some kind of big picture interpretive issues for courts and the role that courts have, or the judicial role, in interpreting statutes. And a lot of this centers around different philosophies about the judiciary and the relationship between the courts and the legislature. And so here I'm going to present three kind of competing views. Now, courts don't always settle on one and stick with it. They sometimes alternate, sometimes within one opinion. But the case books for different classes, to some extent in administrative law and definitely in the statutory interpretation and regulation or legislation and regulation case books, will talk about these different sort of schools of thought of the relationship of the courts to the legislature and how deferential they'll be. And so this is very introductory. This is something you should watch probably at the beginning of the course and keep in mind as you're reading the cases as we go along through the course material. So let's take a look. We have three sort of competing schools of thought or viewpoints to talk about. Number one is what we call the faithful agent view. And this is the idea that a court should be a faithful agent of the legislature, or courts should be faithful agents of the legislature. In other words, it's the legislature's job to make the laws. It's the most democratic branch. And so the court is supposed to try to search for and then defer to the intent or purpose of the legislature in passing the statute. So when a court has to interpret a law under the faithful agent view, its job is to carry out the will of the legislature, to implement what Congress thought it was doing when it passed that statute or that enactment. And instead of being contrary or thwarting the will of Congress, courts should be faithfully carrying out and fulfilling the legislative goals of Congress. This faithful agent view is really based, I think, on a majoritarian idea, right? Because it's going to be the majority that wins Congress or wins control of Congress. And so the idea is that Congress or the legislature represents a majority of the citizens, and we live in a country, a democracy of self-governance, and that is done through elected representatives. So if we're going to govern ourselves, then we do it through our elected representatives, and that's the state legislature or Congress that enacts the laws on our behalf, on behalf of the majority. And so the court is being true to that, but you have to have some belief in majoritarian rule to really buy into the faithful agent view. Now, a contrasting view is what I call the counter-majoritarian view. And this is the idea that the court's not here to just carry water for the legislature or rubber stamp what the legislature wants. The court instead is there to sort of protect vulnerable groups against the tyranny and oppression of majority rule in society. In other words, the poor, racial or ethnic or religious or linguistic minorities in society, and people who have unpopular political views or lifestyles and so forth. And the problem is that majorities will tend to either ignore them or oppress and exploit them, and courts are there to sort of make sure that's not happening. In other words, this view, a counter-majoritarian view, sort of treats statutes with suspicion rather than deference, recognizing that democracy is equals majority rule, and that at least the lesson of history is that majorities like to oppress minority groups or individuals who really don't have as much of a voice in a democracy because they're underrepresented or because they're disadvantaged or live in poverty or have a language barrier or something, or face other types of systemic discrimination. And so this view assumes that the role of the judiciary in relation to the legislature is at least partly to keep the legislature in check and serve as protectors of the powerless. So if you believe that the will of the people should rule, you're more likely to sort of go along with the faithful agent view. And if you really believe in checks and balances, that the three branches of government are there to sort of rein in the others and sort of block them from taking things too far, then that's a more counter-majoritarian view. And so here, actually, sometimes it is the court's job to thwart the will of the legislature, because the legislature is oppressing or exploiting, or in other ways disempowering vulnerable groups and disadvantaged groups in our democracy. There's a third view that my particular casebook I use doesn't talk about at all, that I call the anti-faction view. And this is the idea that courts should read statutes being wary of the capacity of special interest groups to hijack the legislative process through lobbying and dark money and things like that. If you were a big fan of the Federalist Papers, the founding fathers were very concerned about factions. In fact, they thought that factions arguably were the downfall of democracy, or the big weakness of democracy. And that is why we needed checks and balances. Was not to protect against the tyranny of the majority, but to protect against special interest groups. So this view sort of assumes that the problem with democracies is that most citizens are disengaged politically, at least most of the time, focused on other things, right? So they're not thinking about the process that we should have for approving vaccines, or whether the government should fund the development of vaccines and distribute them, or if it should just subsidize private companies that do it, or if it should just leave vaccines to the free market. These are sort of big picture issues. How do we regulate financial markets and currency values and higher education? How do we give accreditation to institutions of higher accreditation? And most people are honestly really just focused on making a living and surviving and taking care of their families and looking forward to the next holiday and so forth. And they're not really thinking about these things. And that the downside of that is that a well-organized, highly motivated faction or special interest group, or maybe even a lone billionaire, can take over, right? Can start to become the puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes. And so that's a concern. And if you buy into that idea, then you might assume that a lot of the stuff that comes out of the legislature is really there to serve the interests of one special interest group and at the expense of everyone else. So judges with this view approach statutes with skepticism, presuming that legislation often serves the interest of some small special interest group, maybe with a lot of money or influence, or that is really organized politically, at the expense of the majority, and maybe at the expense of other minority groups too, or everyone else. And so you don't have to pick one of these views at the beginning of our class or even at the end of the semester, but some students already kind of favor one of them. Some students really like the majoritarian view and hate judicial activism and want to see judges basically just fulfill the will of the legislature. Others believe that courts are there to stop Congress from going off the deep end, and the executive branch from seizing power and being tyrannical. And others are actually really worried about special interest groups and are hoping that judges are immune from that because they're apolitical. And so whichever view you lean towards, it will be useful for you in the course to be able to at least to empathize with other viewpoints so that you can follow the interpretive intuitions that run through the cases we study. Because a lot of the judges when they are writing a case, are sort of working within one of these three frameworks, and the type of logic that flows from that becomes very intuitive for how we interpret statutes and how much weight we give to what the parties are asking for, or what the government is doing, asking us their interpretation, or what we think was going on at the legislature when they passed the bill. Also, please note that these different sort of schools of thought or philosophies about how literally to take statutes. The textualists, the intentionalists, and the purposivists, which we will talk about in some more depth in my class, all claim that their view is actually the best way to fulfill what the legislature wanted. None of them are really saying that they're, with the second or third view, trying to thwart the legislature or keep it in check. They generally see the courts adopt textualism because they think that it fits with be a faithful application of the statutes, or the intentionalists think that they're really investing to find the intent of the legislature. The ones focused on purpose are really focusing on what the legislature overall was trying to achieve, or the purpose of enactment. That concludes our little introductory lecture about the relationship between the judiciary and its role and the legislature when we're interpreting statutes, and especially when we're analyzing the executive branch's interpretation of statutes in administrative law.